first task force that is going to present, which is the post-secondary task force. First of all, is Eva Lieberman around? If you could stand up. Eva is one of the co-chairs. Could anyone else that was on that task force please stand up? I saw a couple. Princess, I think you're here. Other members of the task force, please stand up. And Anthony Wensley was also a co-chair of the task force. And Anthony, I'd like you to come forward. Anthony is a professor here at UTM, and Anthony is going to introduce our speaker for the post-secondary task force.
Thank you, Brian. Of course, I'll be very quick. I'd like to thank Brian and Shelley and all the support that we got in our task force. I'd like to thank Eva for her outstanding co-chairing and all the people who worked with us over so many months. When I was asked, would I introduce my colleague, Professor Uli Kroll, who's the Vice Principal of Research here in the AstraZeneca chair, I was delighted. The thought of presenting it falling to Uli was a wonderful opportunity. Uli has worked tirelessly on many of the issues relating to the task force, and indeed, as he will explain, we've been very lucky in a sense there being parallel processes going on in addition to the task force, which have meant that essentially we are going to move forward on implementation of the task force much more smoothly than I think we looked at the early stages of the task force. So without any more ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Uli Kroll to talk to you about the task force.
In a sense, come to the same conclusion as you as a professional have identified as being necessary to drive process forward. And I think for that reason, I'm very excited because I know we're going in the right direction. To put some meat behind this, what I'll do is start with the concept of trying to identify what the issues are and then move through the vision and so on and so on. I think there's a template of slides here that will be used by most everyone. Recognize that what I'm going to put up on the screen here, first of all, is dense, and I'll try to highlight a few things, but it obviously cannot collect all of the ideas that we put forward. So I'm going to break it out into three main ideas here. Number one, the concept being that, well, we all intrinsically know that as technology moves forward, as we talk about the need to create an economy based on brain power, more and more individuals are going to require higher levels of education. We talk about this as post-secondary education. You're sitting in a facility for post-secondary education. Don't be misled in the sense that post-secondary means university or even college. Apprenticeship, any form of post-secondary education is really what we're interested in looking at here. And the concept really becomes one of realizing that not only do individuals require more education, but also the right kind of education. Imagine the type of society you would have if most of the individuals in the society were trained as lawyers versus a society you would have as most are trained as engineers. And obviously, I'm not suggesting one or the other is the right mix, but it will give you a snapshot as to why it's so important to think about what it is that you're training for. Second point here is that if you take a look at the university system, the college system, even the apprenticeship system to some degree, you realize that training is taking place often for jobs that will not be available once the trainees are out in the marketplace. There's another very important aspect to this also, and that is how we teach. Do we teach just on the basis of technologies or skills from the standpoint of how one uses their hands or a pen or a calculator? Perhaps what's required here is really formalization of intrinsic skills that are required from the standpoint of communication, from the standpoint of thought processes of how you take an idea and start to move it forward. And that's the last bullet point here. We've heard the word innovation over and over again, and I'm going to put to you a specific twist on innovation. Mayor of Calgary talked about innovation, talked about, I guess, the East Village, talked about bicycle lanes, a number of examples. And what I would put to you is that individuals behind the scenes have been thinking creative ideas for some period of time, suggesting these would be the ways to move the city forward, to deal with specific problems. But it's the implementation, the concept of innovation, taking the creative idea and understanding how to drive it forward into that implementation that makes all the difference. So what we're really thinking about here in terms of a vision is creation of a culture of innovation for the city of Mississauga and for the region. And David, this is your point. This is not something that can happen only within the city of Mississauga. It's something that's embraced by all partners in terms of moving forward. And the concept here is, well, how would you roll something like this forward? Do we have an example of what this even looks like? I think we can agree that the Mayor of Calgary, in a sense, almost embodies an example of what a culture of innovation, someone who's innovative, can look like. And not necessarily tied always to economic or commercial benefit, but rather the whole process of innovation for quality of life, for change that is something that one can live with and mature with over an entire, whether it's a career, a family, a lifetime. And as you look through these bullet points, you recognize there are numerous places that we as a community can intersect. We can roll this out from the standpoint of individuals, even in the lowest grades, in terms of asking them not just to think of an idea, but think of how you would actually implement and innovate in that particular sense. We can do it from the standpoint of training. One of the questions, Gilbert, I think you were asking a question about newcomers to Canada. UTM has actually pioneered a project here in Ontario that has built science training for newcomers as an experiment, and that's being rolled out by the School of Continuing Studies. There's a number of these particular areas that we can focus on and actually start driving this culture of innovation if we have the right partnerships and if we have the right, if you will, individuals involved who want this. The big idea, well, what we need to begin with is this concept that this culture of innovation really starts with individuals. It's people. It's not driven by the city, it's not driven by corporations, it's driven in each and every one of us. And so what we're going to be talking about here is, in a sense, creating a shared vision that people can rally behind. And how do we do that? Well, we're going to have some leadership step up to the plate and actually demonstrate that this is the direction that they're willing to put their time and effort in terms of nurturing, of advising to move this particular process forward. We need a senior, influential leadership committee, if you will. And David, this is your point, the new association and how one drives change, to actually take the reins and pull this forward. These individuals on this particular group have to be in positions that can empower the implementation, but they also have to be individuals, at least some of them on the group, that have a deep history and insight in terms of how innovation and innovation practices work. The post-secondary institutions, whether they're colleges, universities, or others, they are, in a sense, the buffer, the connector, taking ideas from this innovation group and actually rolling them into the community in a more broad sense, as opposed to just taking these ideas and taking them specifically into an industry, for example. The critical path, how do we actually move forward? Well, what we're going to have to do is focus on at least three main areas. Bring in the equivalent of some manager, a director, a CEO, whatever you'll call that person, who will actually take the reins and be responsible for innovation and drive that forward as what they do in life. And surround that person with the appropriate staff, management staff, administrative staff, to pull projects forward and allow them to take place. We need to find that group of individuals, those innovators and the connectors of those innovators to the community, as that advisory board that comes up with the ideas that will be implemented by these project managers, the CEO. And we need the participation and collaboration of lock, stock, and barrel, industry, post-secondary educational institutions, hospitals, whatever else you can imagine. Now, it's interesting that in the summer, and this is something that, David, you were talking about, a group, HAL was the short form for the consulting group here, you'll see the name up on the slide, they actually did a survey across Mississauga to find out what Mississauga looked like in terms of innovation from the standpoint of economy commercialization, not holistically from the standpoint of society, but with a specific focus, that business-like focus. And what they came to a conclusion of is captured in the set of triangles you see here. And what you'll see are elements of what I've described to you that the Post-Secondary Education Task Force came to very naturally. What's useful in this particular assembly is that this report by HAL has actually set a template in terms of how to drive this forward. There's no way that you're going to be able to read this from any distance, and the point was just to show you there is a detailed template, a thought process in terms of how to drive this forward. And what does it start with? Well, there's some asterisks at the very top there. What it says is you need to build a leadership organization. You need to put the right people in place to actually deliver that leadership message. And you need to do it from the standpoint of targeting, for example, on the talent that exists within Mississauga and exists within the region, connecting right back into the post-secondary educational institutions. If you take a look at what the Post-Secondary Education Task Force suggested, which is on the left-hand side, and you take a look at what's on the right-hand side, which is from the Howe report, you recognize certain names, something called MILA, the Mississauga Innovation Leadership Alliance is what we will be calling this in the future. A number of participants, all of the bullets there represent participants, but on the right-hand side they've been shifted so that what you see at the top are the participants who are primarily involved in innovation because they have to innovate to survive. And the ones at the bottom, those that are separated from innovation from the standpoint of commercialization, yet they still have to innovate and deliver that innovation message. Same ideas, slightly different in structure. The progress that we have, well, with the funding of Howe, in a sense, we have a validation of what the Post-Secondary Education Task Force has done, and done it as, if you will, in parallel, but not being dependent on the Post-Secondary Education Task Force outcomes. We have alignment of strategic plans, and that means that we're in much better position to actually start moving forward. The next steps, find that group of people, the manager, the CEO, really the Chief Innovation Officer is what the Post-Secondary Education Task Force had called it, to drive this agenda into reality. Build that MILA, that Mississauga Innovation Leadership Alliance, and use them to actually start moving forward projects. For example, a project from the Jobs Task Force, the idea of finding some form of, if you will, clubhouse, a community center to provide a focal point for activities. Start working on the basis of building out specific clusters that can be developed from the standpoint of educational activities. And you'll see at the very bottom of the slide here, my challenge to my own institution and to Sheridan, it's time to stop thinking about this, it's time to innovate by doing it. We have to start moving this to implementation. And that's a summary of the Post-Secondary Education Task Force report.